just before midnight, everything at Balmoral appeared quiet. Then, according to this story, an alert changed everything. A security system reportedly detected unexpected movement inside an area connected to Queen Elizabeth's private archive. Within minutes, the atmosphere at Balmoral allegedly transformed. And at the center of the response was Prince Edward. He was not supposedly treating the incident like an ordinary security problem. He was treating it like a possible betrayal from inside the royal circle. Doors were secured. Staff were reportedly ordered to remain where they were. Electronic devices were allegedly taken for examination. And nobody, according to the narrative, was simply allowed to walk away from the situation. The question was no longer just, who entered the restricted area? The much more disturbing question became, who already had permission to enter, because there was reportedly no obvious sign of forced entry. The door was not destroyed. The lock was not visibly damaged. There was no dramatic evidence of an outsider breaking into the castle. Instead, the story claims that whoever entered had something far more valuable than force. They allegedly had legitimate access. And as Prince Edward began examining what had happened, suspicion slowly moved away from an unknown intruder and towards someone much closer to the royal family, Camilla. But why? And what allegedly happened in the days before that midnight alert? That is where the story becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. According to the narrative, the entire incident began with something connected to Queen Elizabeth's private legacy. The story describes a supposedly separate archive at Balmoral, not an ordinary room filled with publicly catalogued royal possessions, but a private collection containing personal materials and family keepsakes. The alleged archive supposedly contained correspondence, jewelry, historic objects, and other possessions accumulated across decades. The important detail was not simply what was inside. It was the claim that access to the collection was extremely restricted. According to the story, only a small number of trusted individuals knew the full extent of what existed there, and that created an unusual problem. If an item disappeared from an ordinary royal collection, there would supposedly be records, inventories, documentation, official references. But this alleged private archive was described differently. The story claims that Queen Elizabeth had deliberately kept certain materials outside the normal public record. And before the room was supposedly sealed, one authority was said to matter above all others: King Charles. According to this narrative, Charles alone had the authority to determine what would happen to those possessions. For years, the alleged secret remained buried. Then came the person who supposedly learned about it: Camilla. The story claims that Camilla did not initially approach the alleged archive directly. Instead, she supposedly learned about it indirectly. One evening at Balmoral, she allegedly overheard longtime servants discussing the existence of a restricted collection. One detail supposedly caught her attention immediately. The contents were private. The inventory was supposedly incomplete, and access was tightly controlled. According to the narrative, Camilla began asking questions. At first, those questions could have appeared completely innocent. After all, members of the royal family would naturally discuss security, history, and family possessions. But the story claims that her interest did not stop there. She allegedly began learning more about how the area was protected, who patrolled it, which guards were responsible, when security rotations changed, and what procedures were followed around the restricted sections. Again, none of those things, by themselves, would necessarily prove wrongdoing. That distinction is important. The narrative is built not around one definitive piece of evidence, but around a collection of alleged details that supposedly became more suspicious when placed together. And one name eventually entered the story: Richard Hale. According to the story, Richard's credential was allegedly the final recorded access before the alarm. Then, investigators supposedly discovered something even stranger. Richard was gone. His quarters reportedly still contained his belongings. Personal items remained. There was supposedly no resignation, no farewell message, no obvious explanation, just an empty space where a trusted security figure had been. From Edward's perspective, the narrative makes the connection appear obvious. A trusted guard allegedly enters a restricted area. The alarm activates. The guard disappears. It would be difficult not to investigate that person first. But Edward reportedly did not stop there, because the condition of the archive raised another question. What exactly had Richard been doing inside? According to the narrative, the room did not look like the scene of a carefully executed theft. It looked chaotic. An overturned jewelry box was allegedly found near the entrance. An antique watch had reportedly rolled away. Documents were supposedly scattered across the floor. Other objects appeared disturbed. The story suggests that someone may have been collecting items when the security system activated. Then, apparently, something went wrong. The person supposedly panicked and fled. That created another mystery. If this had been a planned operation, why abandon it so quickly? What caused the person to panic? And perhaps most importantly, who knew enough about the archive to attempt something like this in the first place? Edward reportedly ordered investigators to examine every available piece of information: access records, security footage, patrol schedules, camera angles, staff movements. And as the investigation expanded, another name allegedly began appearing repeatedly: Camilla. The story does not claim that investigators immediately found one overwhelming piece of evidence. Instead, the suspicion allegedly developed through a pattern. Approximately 10 days before the incident, Camilla had reportedly requested information relating to security systems around the archive area. She allegedly asked questions about patrol schedules. She reportedly showed interest in guard rotations. And according to the narrative, she had also demonstrated interest in the security infrastructure surrounding the restricted area. Individually, those actions could have innocent explanations. Royal security is complicated. Members of the royal family may discuss security arrangements for many legitimate reasons. But investigators in the story were allegedly looking at timing. Why did these questions appear shortly before the midnight incident? Why was Richard Hale supposedly connected to the situation? And why did his access credential allegedly appear immediately before the alarm? Those questions did not prove anything, but according to the narrative, they increased suspicion. Then investigators supposedly reviewed the security footage, and that is where the story takes another dramatic turn. According to the account, security footage allegedly showed multiple meetings between Camilla and Richard Hale in the days leading up to the incident. One meeting reportedly occurred in a garden area behind the castle. Another was allegedly near a corridor connected to restricted sections of the property. Then came the detail that investigators supposedly found most significant. A third meeting allegedly showed Camilla handing Richard what appeared to be a thick envelope. Now the questions became unavoidable. What was inside the envelope? Why were they meeting? Why was Richard suddenly missing? And was the alleged envelope connected to the archive? The story never establishes those answers as verified facts. But within its narrative, the meetings become the bridge connecting the separate pieces of suspicion. Camilla had allegedly shown interest in security. Richard allegedly had access. Richard's credential was reportedly used. The alarm allegedly followed, and Richard supposedly disappeared. For Edward, those connections would have represented a serious investigative lead. But there was still one problem. The evidence could potentially be challenged. The original security system might have been compromised. Access records might be incomplete. Cameras might not tell the entire story. Then Prince William allegedly provided something different, something hidden, something almost nobody knew existed. According to the story, Prince William had secretly arranged for an additional security system to be installed months earlier. The narrative claims that William had not done this because he specifically suspected Camilla or anyone else. Instead, the system was supposedly intended to provide extra protection around important royal assets connected to Queen Elizabeth's legacy. The extraordinary part was allegedly that the system operated independently. It was not simply another component of the main security network, and according to the account, very few people knew about it. The story even claims that King Charles himself was unaware of the system. Whether that detail is accurate is not established by the source. But inside this narrative, the hidden system becomes crucial, because while the main security network might potentially be questioned, the supposedly independent system recorded something else. Activity at the same time. According to the story, the hidden sensors detected movement precisely when Richard Hale's access credential was allegedly used. That was the moment the investigation supposedly changed again. Edward now had two separate systems pointing toward the same event. One official access record, one supposedly independent security record, and both allegedly placed Richard at the restricted area at the critical moment. Think about what this would mean within the story. The midnight lockdown was no longer simply about finding an intruder. It was about determining whether someone inside the royal household had abused their trust. That is a completely different kind of crisis, because castles can be secured, doors can be locked, gates can be closed, but trust is much harder to restore. If the person responsible was an outsider, the solution could be relatively straightforward. Identify them, find out how they entered, recover whatever was taken, strengthen security. But if the person responsible was someone who had legitimate access, then every assumption would have to be reconsidered. Who knew about the archive? Who knew about the security schedules? Who could approach the restricted areas without immediately attracting attention? Who had contact with Richard? And who might have had a reason to know what was stored there? According to the narrative, those questions brought Camilla under increasingly intense scrutiny. But again, suspicion is not proof. That distinction matters. The story describes an alleged investigation, not a confirmed criminal finding. And yet, within the narrative, Edward reportedly could no longer ignore the pattern. The most important character development in this story is Prince Edward himself. At the beginning, he is simply responding to an emergency. Then he becomes an investigator. Then he becomes the person enforcing the security restrictions around Balmoral. And finally, according to the narrative, he becomes the royal figure trying to determine whether the danger is coming from outside the family or from within it. His alleged decision to keep people inside the property becomes symbolic. No one leaves. No one simply walks away. No explanation is accepted without examination. Every movement matters. Every access record matters. Every meeting matters. And every relationship surrounding the archive becomes part of the investigation. This is why the midnight alert is so important. The alarm did not merely reveal movement. According to the story, it exposed a chain of relationships that had allegedly been developing for days. And at the end of that chain was one question. Was Richard Hale acting alone? The narrative strongly suggests that Edward did not believe he was. The allegations surrounding Camilla are therefore built around a sequence rather than one conclusive revelation. She allegedly learned about the private archive. She allegedly became interested in its security. She reportedly asked about patrols and guard rotations. She allegedly met Richard multiple times. One meeting supposedly involved an envelope. Richard's access credential allegedly opened the archive. The alarm reportedly activated. Richard then allegedly disappeared. And finally, investigators supposedly discovered that William's independent security system had captured activity at the same moment. That is the sequence presented by the story. But there remains a missing piece: intent. What did Camilla allegedly want? Was she actually interested in the archive for personal reasons? Was the security information connected to something else? Was Richard acting under instructions? Or could all of these events have explanations that the narrative simply does not provide? Those questions are exactly what make the story suspenseful, because the evidence described so far may create suspicion. But suspicion still needs an explanation. And that explanation, according to the story, had not yet been fully uncovered. Then came the moment William reportedly shared the hidden security information with Edward. According to the narrative, Edward had spent hours looking at contradictory clues. But now he supposedly had something different. Independent confirmation, a second system, a second record, a separate layer of evidence that allegedly placed activity inside the restricted area at precisely the moment Richard's authorized credential was used. And suddenly, the disappearance of Richard looked different. The meetings looked different. The security questions looked different. Even the midnight alert looked different, because what first appeared to be an attempted theft could potentially have been something more complicated: an insider operation, a breach of trust, a carefully prepared attempt that supposedly failed only because another security system detected what the main system could not. And if that is what happened within the story, then Edward's lockdown was not simply about protecting royal property. It was about protecting information, protecting evidence, and determining who could still be trusted inside Balmoral. The biggest unanswered question remained Camilla. Was she merely a person whose actions happened to attract suspicion? Or, as this narrative alleges, was she somehow connected to the events that unfolded that night? The story does not provide a verified final answer, but according to its account, Prince Edward was no longer looking for a random intruder. He was looking inward. And once a royal investigation reaches that point, the most dangerous question is no longer, who broke in? It becomes, who opened the door. And that is precisely where this alleged Balmoral mystery ends, with Prince Edward holding a supposedly independent security trail, Richard Hale missing, and Camilla facing a level of suspicion that the royal household could no longer simply dismiss. Because if the midnight alert revealed one thing, according to this story, it was this: the greatest threat to a heavily protected royal residence may not always come from outside the gates. Sometimes the most troubling clue is the person who already has the key.